My parents demanded I cancel my wedding and give them the money to save my brother from his debts, calling me selfish for prioritizing a party. So, I used my professional skills to open their financial records and set a trap they never saw coming. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The phone buzzed on my nightstand, a shrill, insistent vibration that cut through the foggy haze of my fever. I groaned, pulling the thick comforter over my head. It was Saturday morning, the one day of the week I allowed myself to sleep in, and my body was screaming for rest. A nasty flu bug had knocked me off my feet 2 days prior, leaving me with an aching head and a throat that felt like sandpaper. My fiancé, Mark, had tucked me in with a cup of tea and strict orders not to move before heading off to his weekend, coaching gig for the high school basketball team. Reluctantly, I reached out a trembling hand and fumbled for the phone. The caller ID read Mom. A small, weary sigh escaped my lips. I loved my mother, but her calls were rarely just to chat. There was always an agenda, a problem, a crisis, usually involving my younger brother, Leo. Swallowing hard against the soreness in my throat, I swiped to answer. "Hello," I rasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Annabelle, you sound awful. Are you sick?" My mother, Susan, didn't wait for an answer. "Listen, I need you to sit down. Your father and I have to talk to you about something important. It's about Leo." Of course it was about Leo. It was always about Leo. "Mom, I'm already lying down. I have the flu. Can this wait?" "No, it can't wait. This is serious." Her voice was tight with a familiar, manufactured urgency. I could picture her perfectly, pacing the immaculate gray and white kitchen of the house I grew up in, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing wildly as if I could see her through the phone. I shifted against my pillows, a knot of dread forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with the flu. "Okay," I said, bracing myself. "What's wrong?" There was a brief pause, and then I heard my father, Richard, clear his throat in the background. He was on speakerphone. This was an official family summit conducted remotely. "Annabelle," my father's voice boomed, full of false gravitas. "Your brother is in some trouble. His latest app, the one he poured his heart and soul into, didn't get the funding he was expecting. In fact, he's in a significant amount of debt." I closed my eyes. Here we go again. Leo, the golden child, the misunderstood genius, had once again chased a fantastical dream with no safety net, and my parents were once again ready to break his fall. He was 25, but in their eyes, he was a perpetual teenager full of brilliant ideas the world just wasn't ready for. I, at 28, was the stable one, the responsible one, which was family code for the one who is expected to clean up the messes. "How much debt?" I asked, my voice flat. "That's not important right now," my mother snapped. "What's important is that we, as a family, rally around him. He's heartbroken, Annie, devastated. We can't let him sink." "I understand that," I said carefully. "But you and Dad just took out a second mortgage for him a few months ago for this very project. I told you it was a bad idea. What happened to that money?" The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and accusatory. "We're not going to get into a blame game," my father said, his tone turning cold. "We did what we thought was best to support your brother's ambition. You, of all people, with your safe job as a financial analyst, should understand that sometimes you have to take risks." The jab was intentional and it landed perfectly. My safe job was the reason I had a savings account, a retirement plan, and a down payment on a future. It was also the reason I was able to meticulously plan and save for the one big, beautiful thing I had always wanted, my wedding. Mark and I had been planning it for over a year. The venue was booked, the caterer was paid, and my dress was hanging in a garment bag in my closet. In 6 months, I was going to marry the love of my life. "What do you expect me to do?" I asked, although a cold, terrifying suspicion was already taking root in my mind. My mother's voice softened, shifting from demanding to wheedling. It was a tactic I knew all too well. "Honey, we know how much you and Mark have saved for the wedding. We are so proud of how responsible you've been." She paused for dramatic effect. "And that's why we know you'll do the right thing. We need you to postpone it." I felt the air leave my lungs. It was worse than I thought. Postpone it. "Well, cancel it for now," my father corrected, his voice blunt. "Weddings are just parties, eh? Belle, extravagant, expensive parties. Leo's future is on the line. We need the money you've saved, all of it." I was speechless. The hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen seemed to grow louder, filling the sudden, ringing silence in my ears. They wanted me to give up my wedding. They wanted me to take the money Mark and I had painstakingly saved, every penny earned from overtime and skipped vacations, and hand it over to bail out my brother's latest failed fantasy. "We need an answer, Annabelle," my mother pushed. "The people he owes, they're not very patient." My head throbbed, a painful pulse behind my eyes. The fever, the body aches, they were nothing compared to the sickness that washed over me in that moment. It was a chilling, profound sense of betrayal, colder and sharper than any illness. They weren't asking. They were telling. They had discussed it, decided on it, and were now simply informing me of my expected sacrifice. My wedding, my future, my happiness, it was all just a resource to be liquidated for Leo. My throat was too tight to form words. All I could think about was the look on Mark's face when I told him. All I could see was my beautiful wedding dress, a symbol of a future that my own parents were trying to dismantle. They had always favored him, but this was a new level of disregard for my life. "Annabelle, are you there?" My mother's voice chirped, oblivious. "We knew you, understand. You've always been the sensible one." The sensible one? The one who could be broken without complaint. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper, a single, devastating realization. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The rest of the day passed in a surreal blur of fever and heartbreak. After the call ended, I lay in bed, the phone still clutched in my hand, replaying their words over and over. "Weddings are just parties. Leo's future is on the line. You've always been the sensible one." Each phrase was a small, sharp stone pelting against the fragile glass of my composure. My own parents had just devalued the most significant event of my adult life into a frivolous expense, a piggy bank to be smashed for their favored son. The flu symptoms were a dull, distant ache compared to the acute pain in my chest. When Mark came home that evening, he found me sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the wall. The cup of tea he'd left me was cold and untouched. He took one look at my face, his own expression shifting from cheerful concern to alarm. "Annie, what's wrong? Is your fever worse?" he asked, rushing to my side and placing a cool hand on my forehead. Tears I didn't know I'd been holding back began to stream down my face. I buried my head in his chest and sobbed, the story tumbling out in a broken, hiccuping mess. I told him everything: the phone call, the demand, the casual, crushing way they had dismissed our wedding, our future, our hard work. Mark listened patiently, his arms a solid, comforting weight around me. He didn't interrupt. He just held me, letting me pour out all the shock and hurt. When I finally finished, he gently tilted my chin up, his eyes dark with a protective anger I had rarely seen in him. "No," he said, his voice firm and absolute. "Absolutely not. We are not canceling our wedding." "But my parents," I started, my voice wavering. "Are being unbelievably selfish and manipulative," he finished for me. "Annabelle, this is not a reasonable request. This is emotional blackmail. They are asking you to set yourself on fire to keep your brother warm, and they've been doing it your whole life. This is just the most blatant it's ever been." His unwavering support was a balm on my raw emotions. He was right, of course. This was a pattern just magnified. Every school project I had, every part-time job, every achievement had always been framed by how it could or couldn't benefit Leo. My savings for my first car were borrowed for Leo's class trip to Europe. My first bonus from work was loaned to help Leo with rent after he quit a job he found unfulfilling. The money was never returned, the sacrifices never acknowledged. Later that evening, my mother called again. I saw her name flash on the screen and my stomach clenched. Mark gave me a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "Let me talk to her," he offered. "No," I said, taking a deep breath. "I have to do this." I answered, putting the phone on speaker. "Hello, Mom." "Annabelle, darling, I was just calling to see how you were feeling," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "And to see if you've had a chance to talk to Mark about, you know." "I have," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "And we're not canceling the wedding." The line went silent for a moment. The syrupy warmth in her tone instantly evaporated, replaced by an icy chill. "What do you mean, you're not canceling it? Did you not understand what your father and—" "I told you, your brother is in serious trouble." "I understand perfectly," I replied, choosing my words with care. "But Mark and I have worked for over a year for this. It's our future. Leo's financial problems are his own to solve. He's an adult." "He is your brother," she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. "How can you be so selfish? After everything we've done for you, we gave you a wonderful childhood, a college education." "A college education?" I repeated, a bitter laugh almost escaping my lips. I stopped myself just in time. The full story of my college fund was a topic for another day, a day when I had more than just a gut feeling. "You expect me to throw away over $20,000 of our savings because Leo made another bad decision. That's not being a family, Mom. That's being an emergency fund." "You are twisting my words," she seethed. "You have a good job. You can save the money again. This is a once-in-a-lifetime crisis for Leo." Every crisis of Leo's was a once-in-a-lifetime crisis. The phrase had lost all meaning. "My wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event for me," I said quietly. "And I'm not giving it up. The answer is no." I could hear my father muttering angrily in the background. "This is Mark's influence," he grumbled, loud enough for me to hear. "He's turning her against us." "This has nothing to do with Mark," I shot back, my patience finally snapping. "This has to do with me finally putting my own life first. The conversation is over." I ended the call before she could respond, my hand trembling. Mark pulled me into another hug. "You were amazing," he said softly. "You were strong and you set a boundary." I nodded, leaning into him, but my mind was racing. My parents' reaction wasn't just disappointment, it was pure, unfiltered fury. They weren't just asking for help, they felt entitled to my life savings. Their immediate pivot to guilt and accusations confirmed that this wasn't about a family discussion, it was about compliance. As I sat there, a chilling thought began to form, a tiny seed of suspicion that I had long ignored. They were too desperate. The story about Leo's debt felt real, but their pressure on me felt like it was hiding something more. A thought repeated in my mind, a quiet but persistent whisper. They were counting on my compliance, on my history of giving in. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten my profession. They had forgotten that my entire career was built on looking at numbers and finding the truth hidden within them. The days following that disastrous phone call were a masterclass in emotional warfare. My mother, Susan, alternated between tearful, guilt-laden voicemails about how I was tearing the family apart and curt, one-sentence texts that read, "Leo is not sleeping. He is so worried." My father, Richard, took a different approach, complete silence. He was punishing me with his absence, a tactic he'd perfected throughout my childhood. It was meant to make me feel isolated and desperate for his approval. For the first time in my life, however, it didn't work. Instead of feeling guilt, I felt a simmering anger. My parents had always operated under a simple, unspoken rule. Leo was the sun, and the rest of us were planets who were expected to orbit him. He was the artist, the visionary, the one with boundless potential that was always just on the verge of being realized. I was the pragmatist, the planner, the reliable daughter whose achievements were not celebrated so much as they were noted with a quiet nod. My straight A's were expected. My scholarship to a state university was a sensible choice that saved the money. My career as a financial analyst was a good, safe path. Their devotion to Leo was blinding. I remembered being 16 and saving up for months from my after-school job to buy a used car. The day I reached my goal, my father sat me down and explained that Leo, then 13, needed expensive tutoring for a subject he was failing. It was framed as an investment in his future. "A car is a depreciating asset, Annabelle," my father had said with an air of profound wisdom. "But your brother's education is priceless." I'd handed over my savings, my dreams of independence temporarily dashed, and watched as Leo continued to neglect his homework. The tutoring money, I later suspected, went towards a brand new gaming console he won in a contest. The second mortgage was the culmination of this lifelong pattern. 6 months ago, they had called a family meeting. Leo, full of manic energy, had presented a slideshow for his new app idea, ConnectSphere, a social media platform that he claimed would revolutionize digital communication. The presentation was slick, full of buzzwords he'd clearly learned from watching documentaries about Silicon Valley. But as a financial analyst, I saw gaping holes in his business plan. There was no clear path to monetization, no research on the target demographic, and a budget that was wildly unrealistic. I had tried to voice my concerns gently. "Leo, this is an ambitious project," I had started, "but the market is incredibly saturated. Have you considered starting with a smaller, more focused prototype to test the concept?" My mother had shot me a look that could curdle milk. "Annabelle, please don't be so negative," she'd chided. "Your brother needs our support, not criticism." My father had nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. We believe in him." A week later, they told me they had taken out a second mortgage on their house, the house they were supposed to have paid off in 5 years, to give Leo the seed money he needed. I was horrified. I warned them about the risks, about leveraging their entire financial security on Leo's flimsy business plan. They dismissed my concerns as a lack of vision. "You're too cautious, Annie," my father said. "You have to think bigger." Now that leap of faith had evidently ended in a nosedive, and they expected me to provide the parachute. The primary antagonist in this drama wasn't just Leo, with his charming irresponsibility and inability to face consequences. It was my parents, Richard and Susan, who had cultivated this dynamic. My mother, with her polished exterior and expertly wielded emotional guilt, was the architect of the family's narrative. She presented a perfect image to the outside world: 2 wonderful children, one a creative genius and the other a stable professional. Behind closed doors, she was the enforcer, ensuring my stability was always at the service of his genius. My father was the silent partner in this emotional enterprise. He was a man who valued the appearance of success above all else. Leo, with his grand pronouncements and talk of becoming a tech mogul, was a reflection of the success my father had always wanted for himself. My quiet, steady progress was less impressive. He saw Leo's failures not as failures, but as the daring stumbles of a future titan. My refusal to fund those stumbles was, in his eyes, a direct betrayal of the family's shared ambition. He wasn't just disappointed in me. He was infuriated that I was refusing to play my assigned part in the grand play of Leo's inevitable success. Sitting across from Mark at our small kitchen table, stirring my soup, I felt a clarity I hadn't felt before. "It's not just about the money," I said, looking at him. "It's about the fact that they don't see me. They see a resource, a backup plan. My entire life has been a dress rehearsal for whatever crisis Leo was going to have next." Mark reached across the table and took my hand. "So what do we do?" I thought about their desperation, about the sheer panic in my mother's voice when she'd shrieked at me. The story didn't quite add up. Even for Leo, this level of financial ruin seemed extreme, and my parents' reaction was disproportionate. It wasn't just about protecting Leo anymore. It felt like they were protecting themselves. The thought that had been a whisper was now a clear, loud voice in my head. "I'm going to do my job," I said, a new resolve hardening my voice. "I'm going to do what they taught me to be, the sensible, responsible one. I'm going to analyze the data." They had forgotten who I was. I wasn't just their daughter. I was a professional trained to uncover the truth in a balance sheet. and I had a strong suspicion that my family's emotional bankruptcy was reflected in a very real, very hidden financial one. The decision to investigate wasn't made out of spite. It was born from a deep, instinctual need for self-preservation. For years, I had willingly played the role of the dutiful daughter, accepting the family narrative without question. Now, that narrative had been shattered. If I was going to be accused of being selfish and unloving, I deserved to know the full truth of the situation I was being asked to salvage. My initial anger began to cool, replaced by the focused, methodical calm I felt when I was handed a complex financial portfolio at work. This was just another case, albeit a deeply personal one. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. I was working late, trying to distract myself with spreadsheets and projections, when a text from my mother came through. It was a photo of Leo, slumped on the living room couch, staring blankly at the television. He looked miserable. The caption read, "This is what you're doing to him." The manipulation was so blatant, so emotionally clumsy, that it didn't hurt me. It galvanized me. I shut my laptop, packed my bag, and drove home to Mark. "I'm doing it," I announced the moment I walked through the door. "I'm going to look into their finances. I still have the login information for their online banking portal from when I helped Dad set it all up last year." Mark looked up from the book he was reading, his expression serious. "Are you sure, Annie? Once you cross that line, you can't unsee what you fin." "Day." "I need to know," I said, my voice firm. "I need to know what I'm saying no to. I need to know if I'm refusing to help my brother or if I'm refusing to enable my parents." He nodded slowly. "Okay, I'm with you. What's the plan?" My clever trap, as it were, wasn't a trap at all. It was simply the truth, armed with documentation. My leverage was my professional skill set. For years, my parents had praised my meticulous nature and my head for numbers when it suited them, when I was helping them file their taxes or creating a budget for them. They had freely given me access to their financial world, never imagining that the tools they encouraged me to sharpen would one day be used to dissect their own deceptions. That night, with a pot of strong coffee brewing and Mark sitting quietly beside me for support, I logged into their main bank account. The password was Leo, the genius one. I almost laughed. My plan was simple. I would start with the disbursement from the second mortgage and trace where every single dollar went. The loan amount was substantial, $150,000. According to my parents, it was all for Leo's company, ConnectSphere. I found the initial wire transfer to an LLC that Leo had set up. The amount was $100,000. A huge sum, but it still left $50,000 unaccounted for. Where had the rest of it gone? My heart began to beat a little faster. I started scrolling through the transaction history for the weeks following the loan disbursement. And then I saw it. A charge for $12,000 to a luxury cruise line. The transaction date was just 3 days after the mortgage had funded. I remembered them mentioning a last-minute getaway to celebrate their anniversary, which I had thought was a little extravagant at the time. They'd claimed they found an unbelievable deal. This was no deal. This was a high-end, all-inclusive Caribbean cruise. I kept digging. I found charges from expensive furniture stores, high-end electronics shops, and several withdrawals from the ATM at a local casino. In total, I calculated that my parents had spent over $30,000 of the mortgage money on themselves. They hadn't just funded Leo's business. They had funded a lifestyle they couldn't afford, using their house as an ATM. A wave of nausea washed over me, stronger than any symptom the flu had given me. This wasn't just about bailing out Leo. They had squandered a significant portion of the money, and now that Leo's share was gone too, they were all in a deep financial hole. Their panicked demand for my wedding fund suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't just trying to save Leo. They were trying to save themselves from the consequences of their own recklessness. But I knew this was only part of the story. The vehemence of their reaction, my mother's mention of my college education, as something they had benevolently given me, had triggered a deeper, older suspicion. I navigated to a different section of the bank's portal, one that showed archived statements from closed accounts. I searched for the custodial account that had been set up for me when I was a child, my college fund. My grandparents had contributed generously to it over the years. When I was 17, my parents had sat me down and explained, with great sadness, that the fund had taken a massive hit in the 2008 market crash and there was very little left. I had believed them. I'd worked 2 jobs through college to avoid massive loans, always feeling a pang of disappointment but never suspicion. I found the old account and downloaded the statements from that period. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. I scrolled through the transaction history, my eyes scanning the columns of numbers. There was no catastrophic loss from a market downturn. Instead, 8 years before the crash, there was a single, massive withdrawal that had drained the account of nearly its entire balance, $30,000. The date was just 2 weeks after Leo, then a teenager, had been in a minor car accident with an uninsured driver, damaging a brand-new luxury sedan. My parents had told everyone that their insurance had covered it completely. It was a lie. They had stolen my future to fix his mistake. They had taken my college fund, my head start in life, and used it to erase a consequence for him, then lied to my face about it for over a decade. I pushed back from the table, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. Mark was by my side instantly, his hand on my back. "Annabelle, what is it?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the screen. I watched his eyes scan the damning numbers, saw his expression harden from concern to pure, cold rage. The trap was no longer just about refusing to pay. It was about confronting them with a decade of lies. The investigation was over. Now, it was time for the reckoning. The next step required a delicate strategy, a full-blown ambush with. All the evidence would likely result in a complete shutdown. My parents were masters of deflection and denial. If I presented everything at once, they would paint me as a snooping, ungrateful child who had violated their privacy. I needed to unravel their story thread by thread, forcing them to lie in real time, to trap themselves in their own deception. I decided to start with the most recent, and perhaps most easily explained, discrepancy: the cruise. I waited until the next afternoon, giving myself time to calm my shaking hands and organize my thoughts into a clear, concise plan. I needed to be the composed financial analyst, not the wounded daughter. Emotion was their weapon of choice. Logic would be mine. I called my mother. Mark sat beside me on the couch, a silent pillar of support. "Annabelle," my mother answered, her voice cold and clipped. She was still in punishment mode. "I hope you're calling to tell me you've come to your senses." "I'm calling to ask a few questions, Mom," I said, keeping my tone level and professional. "I'm trying to understand the whole financial picture here. You're asking me for a significant amount of money, and as a financial analyst, I need to understand the full scope of the liability before I can even consider it." This framing seemed to catch her off guard. Using my professional title was a way of establishing authority, of shifting the dynamic from parent-child to a more formal consultation. "Well, it's very complicated," she stammered. "It's business debt, legal fees." "I understand," I cut in smoothly. "Let's start with the source of the funds. The second mortgage was for $150,000, correct?" "Yes, that's right." "And all of that went to Leo's business, ConnectSphere?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like a baited hook. There was a telling pause. It was only a second long, but in that brief silence, I could hear the gears turning in her head. She was calculating, weighing the risk of the lie against the risk of the truth. She chose the lie. "Yes, of course," she said, a little too quickly. "Every penny. He had startup costs, developer salaries. It's incredibly expensive to launch something like that." "I see," I said, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "That's interesting, because I was just looking at your bank statement from last March. You know, when I was helping Dad organize his tax receipts, I must have saved a copy. And I saw the $100,000 transfer to Leo's LLC. But I also saw a $12,000 charge to a cruise line. I thought that was odd. Can you explain that?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear her mind racing, searching for an escape route. Her first instinct was to attack. "How dare you?" she finally sputtered, her voice rising with indignation. "Are you spying on us, Annabelle? Going through our private finances? After everything we've done for you, this is the thanks we get." "I'm not spying, Mom," I said calmly, refusing to take the bait. "I'm trying to reconcile the numbers. You're asking me to sacrifice my wedding fund. I think I have a right to know if my sacrifice is going to solve the problem or if it's just plugging a hole in a sinking ship. So, the cruise, was that a business expense for ConnectSphere?" My question was ridiculous, and we both knew it. The sheer absurdity of it was designed to corner her. She couldn't possibly claim a Caribbean cruise was a legitimate startup cost. It was a gift," she finally managed, her voice strained. "From a friend, we paid them back in cash." The lie was so flimsy, so poorly constructed, it was almost pitiable. People don't put $12,000 charges on their credit cards for friends who are gifting them a cruise. The story made no sense. "Paid them back with what cash, Mom?" I pressed gently. "Your account shows multiple large cash withdrawals from the casino ATM around the same time. Was that related?" Her composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to explain my spending to you. You are an ungrateful, selfish child. We ask you for one thing, one single thing to help your brother, your own flesh and blood, and you turn it into this interrogation." "I'm asking for the truth," I said simply. "Because what you're telling me isn't adding up. You spent at least $30,000 of the mortgage money on yourselves, didn't you?" She didn't answer. Instead, I heard my father's muffled roar in the background. He grabbed the phone from her. "That's enough, Annabelle," he boomed. "Your mother is right. This is none of your business. We are your parents. You owe us your respect. The money was ours to spend as we saw fit. We needed a break after all the stress of helping your brother." His admission, cloaked in anger and entitlement, was all the confirmation I needed. They had spent the money. They felt justified, and they were furious at having been caught. "So you lied," I stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You lied about where the money went, and you're trying to guilt-trip me into fixing a problem that you helped create. A problem that is much bigger than just Leo's debt." "You don't understand anything," he snarled, his voice thick with rage. "You sit in your safe little apartment with your safe little job, judging us. You have no idea what real pressure is." "Then explain it to me," I challenged. "Tell me the real story, all of it, starting with what really happened to my college fund." The line went dead. He had hung up on me. I lowered the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. I had shattered their narrative. I had exposed the first lie, and in doing so, I had confirmed my own suspicions. Their frantic, angry reaction was that of cornered animals, lashing out with threats and insults because they had no truth to defend themselves with. The first confrontation was over. Now, it was time to build the case. My father hanging up was not the end. It was a declaration of war. The next 48 hours were a relentless siege. The phone calls and texts became more frequent, more desperate. My aunt, my mother's sister, called to tell me she was deeply disappointed in my lack of family loyalty. My grandmother, my father's mother, left a quavering voicemail about the importance of sibling bonds. My parents were circling the wagons, painting me as a cold-hearted villain to the entire extended family, none of whom knew the real story. They were trying to isolate me, to use the weight of family opinion to crush my resolve. But with every call, my determination hardened. They weren't just liars, they were masterful manipulators, willing to damage my reputation to get what they wanted. Meanwhile, Leo, the supposed cause of this entire crisis, remained silent. He didn't call. He didn't text. He was allowing our parents to fight his battles for him, a comfortable and familiar role for him to play. This passivity was, in its own way, the most infuriating part. He was perfectly content to let me be the villain as long as there was a chance my villainy might end with him getting a payout. I ignored the calls and focused on my task. The revelation about the crews and their personal spending spree was damning, but the theft of my college fund was the emotional core of their betrayal. I needed irrefutable proof, something more than just a digital bank statement they could dismiss as a misunderstanding or a fabrication. I remembered that my grandparents, who had established the fund, were meticulous record keepers. My grandfather had passed away a few years ago, but my grandmother was still sharp. The problem was, she was the one who had just left me the guilt-ridden voicemail. Approaching her directly would be walking into an ambush. But I recalled that after my grandfather's death, my grandmother had given me a box of his old things, papers and mementos she thought I might want. It was still in the back of my closet. With a surge of adrenaline, I pulled the dusty box out and began to sift through old photographs, letters, and report cards. At the very bottom, tucked inside a leather-bound folder, I found it, a complete file labeled Annabelle's Education. Inside were copies of every deposit slip, every bank statement, and most importantly, a signed letter from my grandfather to my parents, dated a few months before the large withdrawal. It explicitly stated that the funds were to be used solely for Annabelle's college tuition and related educational expenses. Beneath it was another document, a copy of the withdrawal slip. It was for $30,000, and it was signed by my father. The date matched the statement I had downloaded perfectly. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof. This wasn't just poor financial management. This was a direct violation of my grandparents' trust and a theft of my future. Armed with this new evidence, I felt a shift inside me. The hurt and shock were still there, but they were now overlaid with a cold, hard anger. This was no longer just about refusing to give them money. This was about holding them accountable for decades of deception. I knew a second confrontation was necessary, one that would finally break through Leo's passive silence. I needed to get him in a room, away from my parents' influence, and show him the truth. I sent him a single text. "We need to talk. Alone. It's about Mom and Dad's finances. Meet me for coffee tomorrow at 10 a.m. If you don't come, you'll never see a dime from me now or ever." The ultimatum was harsh, but it was the only language he would understand. To my surprise, he agreed. He was already there when I arrived at the coffee shop, hunched over a table in the corner, looking pale and stressed. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "What's this about, Annie?" he mumbled into his latte. "Mom and Dad are free." "Aching out. They said you're accusing them of all sorts of crazy things." I didn't say a word. I simply opened my laptop, turned it to face him, and showed him the scanned image of the withdrawal slip from my college fund, signed by our father. Then I placed my grandfather's letter beside it. He stared at the screen, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this?" "That's my college fund," I said quietly. "The one Mom and Dad told me was wiped out in the market crash. That's a $30,000 withdrawal slip, signed by Dad. The date is 2 weeks after you wrecked that sedan in high school." Leo's face went white. He looked from the laptop to the letter and back again. I could see the dawning horror in his eyes as the pieces clicked into place. He remembered the accident. He remembered the miraculous way the problem had just disappeared. "No," he whispered. They wouldn't." "They did," I said, my voice unwavering. "They took my future and used it to clean up your past, and they have been lying to both of us about it ever since." I then walked him through the rest of it. The second mortgage, the $30,000 they spent on cruises and casinos, the lies they told me on the phone. I presented it calmly, factually, like I was briefing a client. Leo just sat there, his head in his hands. He was seeing, for the first time, the true cost of his golden child status. He wasn't a misunderstood genius being supported by loving parents. He was a product, an excuse for their own greed and irresponsibility. His dreams were the cover story for their financial mismanagement. The spell they had woven around him, his entire life was beginning to break. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear, Annie, I thought the mortgage money, they told me the business just needed more than we thought. They said you were being selfish." "I know what they said," I replied. The question is, what do you believe now? Are you going to keep letting them lie for you and to you, or are you finally going to grow up? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a conflict I had never seen in him before, a battle between his lifelong dependency and a new, terrifying understanding of the truth. The foundation of his world had been ripped out from under him. The second confrontation was over, and it hadn't been with my parents. It had been with the person at the center of the storm. The final showdown was yet to come, but I knew now that I wouldn't be facing it alone. The final confrontation was set for Sunday dinner. My parents, believing they had successfully guilted me into submission through their campaign of family pressure, summoned me to the house for what they called a final discussion. The subtext was clear. This was my last chance to capitulate and hand over the money. My mother's text was sickeningly sweet. Let's put all this ugliness behind us and be a family again. We'll have your favorite pot roast. 6 p.m., they thought they had won. They had no idea they were walking into the most meticulously prepared presentation of my career. Mark and I arrived at precisely 6. He carried a leather briefcase, a theatrical touch that I appreciated. My parents, Richard and Susan, greeted us at the door with strained, expectant smiles. Leo was already in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch, refusing to look at anyone. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. "Annabelle, Mark, so glad you could make it," my mother chirped, gesturing towards the living room. "Dinner is almost ready. Let's just have a quick chat first." "That's a good idea," I said, my voice calm and even, "because we have a lot to discuss." We all sat down. My parents took the armchairs opposite the couch where Mark and I sat, positioning themselves as a united front. They looked like a king and queen holding court, ready to pass judgment. "Now, Annabelle," my father began, taking charge, "we were very disappointed by your attitude this past week. The accusations you made were deeply hurtful, but we are willing to forgive and forget. We are a family. So, have you and Mark made the sensible decision about helping your brother?" He leaned back, confident, waiting for my apology and my checkbook. Instead of answering, I turned to Mark. "Would you mind?" Mark nodded, opened the briefcase, and pulled out 3 neatly bound folders. He handed one to my mother, one to my father, and placed the third on the coffee table in front of Leo. "What is this?" my mother asked, her smile faltering as she looked at the plain black cover. "That," I said, "is the truth. I believe you called this meeting to discuss a financial matter. So, I've prepared a complete financial portfolio of the family's situation. Please, open it." My father scoffed, tossing the folder onto the table beside him. "I'm not interested in your little games, Annabelle. This is simple. Does your brother get the money or not?" "He does not," I said. "Clearly, and that portfolio will explain why. If you won't look at it, I'm happy to provide a summary." Leo, his hands trembling slightly, opened his folder. My mother, her curiosity getting the better of her, did the same. "Page 1, I began, my voice as steady as if I were in a boardroom, "is a summary of the second mortgage you took out 6 months ago. As you can see, it was for $150,000. Page 2 details the disbursement of those funds. You'll note the $100,000 transfer to Leo's LLC. You'll also note, on pages 3 and 4, a detailed breakdown of $32,000 in personal, non-business-related expenditures. This includes a $12,000 cruise, $7,000 in casino withdrawals, and various other luxury purchases." My mother's face went pale. She slammed the folder shut. "This is an invasion of our privacy." "This is due diligence," I countered smoothly. "You asked me to invest $20,000 into this family crisis. I simply audited the existing financials, and they are, I'm afraid, quite alarming. Which brings me to the next section. Leo, if you'll turn to page 5. Leo, looking utterly miserable, turned the page. Page 5 is a copy of the withdrawal statement from my collegiate custodial account, dated October 2005. You'll see the withdrawal of $30,000. Page 6 is a copy of the original letter from Grandpa, stipulating the funds were for my education only. And page 7 is a copy of the police report from your car accident, which occurred 2 weeks prior to the withdrawal. You will note the estimated damages to the other vehicle were $30,000. My father shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You have no right." "You had no right?" I fired back, my own voice rising for the first time, sharp and clear. "You had no right to steal my future to pay for his mistake. You had no right to lie to me for 15 years. You had no right to ask me to sacrifice my wedding, my happiness, after you had already stolen from me once." The room fell silent, the force of my words hanging in the air. My mother was openly weeping, not tears of remorse, but of fury at being exposed. My father stood there, speechless, his authority utterly dismantled. But the most powerful moment came from Leo. He slowly closed the folder and pushed it away from him on the table. He looked at our parents, his expression one of profound and utter disillusionment. The spell was broken. "You used her college fund to pay for my accident?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "And you never told me." "We were protecting you," my mother sobbed. "No," Leo said, standing up. He looked at them, then at me. For the first time, I saw not the spoiled golden child, but my brother. "You weren't protecting me. You were using me. You used her money to keep me from facing a consequence, and you've been doing it ever since. This whole genius app developer thing, it's a joke, isn't it? It was just an excuse for you both to get more money." He walked over to the briefcase and pulled out the fourth folder, which I had given him that morning. He threw it on the coffee table in front of our parents. "These are job applications," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "For a customer service position and a warehouse job. I'm getting a job tomorrow. I'm going to start paying my own debts, and I'm not taking another dime from you. And you," he said, turning to me, his eyes full of shame, "I am so sorry, Annie." That was the true climax. It wasn't my presentation or my parents' exposure. It was Leo finally breaking free. He made the decisive, triumphant action, not for me, but for himself. He chose reality over their fantasy. In that moment, the entire power dynamic of our family, carefully constructed over 3 decades, crumbled into dust. The aftermath of that Sunday dinner was not a fiery explosion, but a quiet, definitive collapse. There was no more shouting, no more tears. My father simply sank back into his armchair, a deflated man whose authority had evaporated. My mother stared at the wall, her manipulative tactics rendered useless against a stack of documented facts. Mark and I stood up, and without another word, we walked out of the house, leaving the folders and the shattered pieces of their lies behind us. The next week was one of monumental change. Leo was true to his word. He called me 2 days later to tell me he had accepted a full-time job at a local logistics company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. "I've also scheduled a meeting with a debt counselor," he said, his voice humbled. "It's going to take years, but I'm going to pay it all back, including what you should have had for college. I'll pay you back, Annie, I promise." It was the most adult conversation I'd ever had with him. My parents, faced with the reality of their financial ruin, and without me or Leo to bail them out, Ray forced to make the only decision left. A "for sale" sign appeared on their front lawn a month later. They sold the house they had leveraged into oblivion and moved into a small rental apartment across town. The downsizing was a public admission of the failure they had fought so hard to conceal. There were no more luxury cruises, no more expensive gadgets. Their world had shrunk to the size of their actual means. My relationship with them remains strained. My mother has tried to call a few times, attempting to slip back into old patterns of blame and guilt, but her words have lost their power. I no longer feel obligated to listen. I've recommended therapy, telling them that a healthy relationship can only be built on a foundation of truth and accountability, something we have never had. So far, they have refused. My father has not spoken to me since that night. The silence is no longer a punishment. It is a quiet, mutual understanding that our old relationship is over. 6 months after that fateful dinner, Mark and I got married. We didn't cancel or postpone it, but we did make some changes. We decided to forego the large, extravagant affair we had originally planned. Instead, we took the money we had saved and used it for a down payment on a small house of our own, a place to build a future on our own terms. Our wedding was an intimate ceremony in our new backyard, surrounded by a small group of our closest friends. Leo was there. He stood beside Mark as one of his groomsmen. He looked different, thinner perhaps, but his eyes were clear and he stood taller. He gave a short, heartfelt speech at the reception, not about me and Mark, but about accountability and second chances. It was his quiet, public apology, and I accepted it. As for justice, it came in its own quiet way. I used my professional network to connect Leo with a pro bono financial advisor who helped him navigate a manageable bankruptcy, ensuring the aggressive creditors my parents were so afraid of were dealt with legally and fairly. This act of service was not for my parents, but for the brother I was finally getting to know. The ultimate consequence for my parents was not legal trouble or financial ruin, but the loss of the two things they valued most: the appearance of success and control over their children. They were left with only the truth of their own choices. Today, my life is peaceful. It is filled with the love of my husband, the pride of our new home, and the slow, steady process of building a new, honest relationship with my brother. The anger has faded, replaced by a sense of calm vindication. I did not set out to destroy my family, but to save myself. In doing so, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to let people face the consequences of their own actions. I stood up for myself, and in the ensuing silence, everyone was finally forced to stand on their own.